A very good morning to you all once again. I am truly hoping and praying that you are well. I would like us to continue where we left off last week, and so if you would turn to Matthew chapter 7, Matthew 7 from verse 15 onwards. Given the fact that Christians are repeatedly told in the scriptures that we can expect many false prophets in the last days, and given the fact that their falsehood will lead us along the broad way leading to eternal destruction, Jesus in Matthew 7 teaches us about discerning those who are dangerously deceptive. In other words, how we as Christians can identify with accuracy those who are false prophets. The first aspect of that discernment, as we saw last Sunday, has to do with a powerful warning uttered by Jesus. He says, "Watch out for false prophets," meaning that we must be constantly on the lookout for false prophets. So, how can we recognize false prophets? Well, they are not necessarily those who just twist the truth of God, but they are those who can be identified as prophesying presumptuously. In other words, making promises as if they were from God and proclaiming things supposedly from Jesus, but which in fact God did not mandate them to do at all. They have spoken from their own dreams, their own imaginations. And they have done this in both aspects of biblical prophecy. Biblical prophecy, as we saw last week, involves both foretelling and forthtelling. Foretelling is to make a proclamation about some future event which will apparently come to pass. Forthtelling is to proclaim all that God has revealed about himself and his expectations for Christians as they are contained in the Holy Scriptures. So when a prophet foretells some event which does not take place, or when they forthtell, when they preach or teach some doctrine or lesson that is not found in the Holy Scriptures correctly interpreted, they prove to be false, since they demonstrate that God has not sent them. They have been presumptuous. Moving on now to the second part of Jesus' warning is the issue of progressive transformation. Progressive transformation. The issue here is that false prophets are not always immediately identifiable. Number one is the matter of their emergence. Jesus has already told us that they come to us as sheep, when in fact they are actually wolves. He now continues with the notion that false prophets often don't appear to be wolves initially. And so in verse 16 he says, "By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" Evidently, at this time in Palestine, there was a thorn bush called a buckthorn, which had little black berries which closely resembled little grapes. And there was a certain type of thistle which had a flower which, at least at a distance, might well be taken for a fig. Jesus is making the point that initially it is often difficult to draw a distinction between these two plants. And the same goes for prophets. You often can't identify them initially. However, Jesus has just said, "By their fruits you will recognize them." And the sense of that verse is that you will eventually be able to identify them because of the emergence of their false teachings and behavior. Paul says exactly the same thing in Acts 20:29, when he is saying farewell to the Christians in Ephesus. He says, I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. Even from your own number, please note that, even from your own number, i.e., supposed Christians, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. So be on your guard. Eventually, false prophets will be identifiable because, and number two, of the telling evidence of their falsehood. Verse 16 says, by their fruits you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Twice in these verses, Jesus says, by their fruit, you will recognize them. And Jesus is drawing our attention to the quality of a tree and the quality of its fruit. And they ought to correspond. A good tree ought to bear good fruit, and a bad tree will bear bad fruit. It is quite impossible for a good tree to produce bad fruit, and equally impossible for a bad tree to bear good fruit. So, no matter how well hidden a false prophet, a ferocious wolf, might hide their true nature, eventually that true nature will be exposed, it will be revealed by the fruit they produce. And that because ferocious wolves will always and eventually bear bad fruit. They just can't avoid bearing bad fruit. And that bad fruit relates both to the behavior and the doctrine of false prophets. Now, one of the most obvious manifestations of bad behavior and bad doctrine takes place in the realm of finance. If a true Christian wants to discern the true nature of a prophet, then they need to examine that prophet's teaching and use of money. And it is to me absolutely astonishing how often in the entire scriptures false prophets are associated with material greed. So Jeremiah 6:13 says, from the least to the greatest, all are greedy for gain. Prophets and priests alike, all practice deceit. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 1, the judge Samuel was getting old, and it looked like his two sons would take over from him. But of them, we are told, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. Then, in the New Testament, in 2 Peter 2:1, we read, but there were also false prophets amongst the people, just as there will be false prophets among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord. In their greed, these teachers will exploit you with stories they have made up. Then, in 1 Peter 5:2, speaking to young men and elders, Peter says to them, be shepherds of God's flock that are under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not greedy for money, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted, but being examples to the flock. False prophets will eventually reveal their true nature by their teaching about and their handling of money. Now, the early church, unlike the church in our day, took these instructions and these warnings incredibly seriously. In about 100 AD, the first non-canonical book, called the Didache, was published by the church, and it paid particular attention to the teaching and behavior of itinerant prophets, prophets who would travel across the country. And part of the Didache records that a true prophet was to be held in the highest honor. He was to be welcomed. His word must never be disregarded, and his freedom must never be curtailed. Clearly, the Didache took prophecy seriously. However, it goes on to say that he, that is the itinerant prophet, shall remain one day, and if necessary, another day also. But if he remains 3 days, listen to this, he is a false prophet. He must never ask for anything but bread. If he asks for money, he is a false prophet. Prophets all claim to speak in the Spirit, but there is one acid test. By their characters, a true and a false prophet shall be known. Every prophet that teaches the truth, if he do not what he teaches, is a false prophet. If a prophet claiming to speak in the Spirit orders a table and a meal to be set before him, he is a false prophet. Whoever shall say in the Spirit, "Give me money," or any other things, you shall not hear him. But if he tells you to give in the manner of others who have need, let no one judge him. A prophet asking for money effectively for himself, and a prophet asking for money for people who have needs, are two totally different types of prophets. Now, I realize that these attempts to discern whether a man is a true or false prophet pertained specifically to itinerant prophets. However, the practices and teaching of many present-day false prophets demonstrate that many prophets in today's church prove that they are false prophets. If you listen to the teaching which goes on in our churches and on our TV sets, it is a total rarity for there to be no request for money. Moreover, the requests for money are all aimed at pleading for money for that particular church or ministry, for that particular prophet. Then comes the blasphemous promises. We have all heard false prophets insist that if you give to their ministry, and depending on how much you give, God will bless that seed giving and will reward you with a material return way beyond the amount that you have given. The moment we hear the expression seed giving, we need to realize we are dealing with falsehood because of the presupposition of that plea. And the presupposition is that God will give back to me more than I have given to him. That is, it is a form of supposedly giving in worship to God, but actually it is an attempt to manipulate God. I give so that he can give more back to me.